There comes a moment when the world you once knew starts to feel distant. Not wrong, not broken, just strangely out of tune. You walk through the same streets, talk to the same people, sit in the same places, but everything feels slightly disconnected, like you're watching your own life from a few steps away. It's confusing. You can't point to one thing that's changed, yet everything feels different. You laugh, but it doesn't reach the same place inside you. You go through your routines, but they feel hollow, like echoes of a life that no longer fits. You start asking yourself quiet questions. Why does this feel off? Why do I feel like a stranger in my own world? And the scariest one of all, what's happening to me? But maybe nothing's wrong. Maybe you're simply beginning to see with new eyes. Carl Jung once suggested that disconnection isn't a failure. It's the first sign of transformation. When what used to comfort you starts to feel tight, it's not because you're losing yourself, it's because a deeper part of you is waking up. You begin to sense that the roles you've played, the places you've belonged, the goals you've chased, they were pieces of a chapter that has quietly reached its end. You haven't fallen behind. You've simply stepped outside the story you used to live in. It's unsettling. Yes, you start to notice that you no longer fit in conversations you once enjoyed, that you feel out of place in circles that used to define you. But this isn't isolation. It's evolution. It's the faint sound of your next self calling from somewhere beyond what's familiar. Jung might say your psyche has begun its quiet rebellion. It refuses to pretend anymore. It wants truth, even if that truth means walking away from what's known. So when everything starts to feel off, when the places you once felt at home now leave you restless, remember this: you're not breaking down. You're breaking free. And what feels like losing your place in the world is often the first step toward finally finding yourself. Outgrowing your old life rarely begins with a dramatic moment. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. You start noticing small changes that others don't see. The things that used to excite you now leave you unmoved. The conversations that once filled your time start to feel repetitive, predictable, empty. You begin to sense a quiet distance between who you were and who you're becoming. It's not something you can explain. It's something you feel. You laugh at the same jokes, follow the same routines, but somewhere deep inside, there's a quiet voice whispering, "This isn't you anymore." Carl Jung believed that growth often begins in discomfort, that when your outer life no longer reflects your inner truth, the mind begins to push for change. Not because you planned it, but because remaining the same has become too painful. You might try to fight it. You tell yourself, it's just a phase. You try to fit back into the version of yourself that everyone recognizes. But no matter how hard you try, something in you refuses to shrink again. You start losing interest in things that once defined you. Not out of apathy, but because they no longer match the rhythm of your mind. You can feel your thoughts shifting, slowly, steadily, toward something unknown. That's how outgrowing feels. It's subtle. It's unsettling. It doesn't announce itself with clarity. It creeps in like a quiet realization that the life you've built was meant for a person you no longer are. And that realization is both freeing and frightening. Freeing, because you can sense a bigger truth calling you forward. Frightening, because you have no idea what that truth will demand from you. Jung saw this moment as the beginning of individuation, the process where you start to separate from the noise of expectation and move closer to the person buried beneath it. So when life starts to feel too small, when you no longer recognize the person in the mirror of your own routine, it's not failure. It's the quiet evidence that you're outgrowing what once defined you. It's the first breath of a larger self, the one that refuses to live inside the limits of who you used to be. When you begin to outgrow your old life, it doesn't happen peacefully. It comes with tension, a quiet tug-of-war inside you. One part of you wants to stay where it's safe. It tells you, don't change. You know how to survive here. The other part, softer but stronger, whispers, you can't stay here anymore. You feel torn between two directions, between comfort and honesty, between who you were and who you're meant to become. Carl Jung described this as the conflict between the old self and the emerging self. The old self clings to patterns, to approval, to the familiar story. The emerging self wants truth, even if it means losing what you've built. You feel the resistance everywhere, in your body, in your choices, in your silence. You tell yourself you're fine, yet everything in you knows you're not. You feel guilty for wanting more, even when you can't define what more means. You try to explain it, but the words never sound right. The old self speaks in fear. What if you're making a mistake? What if you end up alone? What if there's nothing waiting for you on the other side? But the emerging self doesn't answer with logic. It answers with a feeling, that quiet, undeniable pull towards something real. And even though it scares you, that pull feels like truth. This is the moment Jung believed most people resist. Because to follow that inner call means dismantling everything false, the masks, the roles, the identities that once kept you safe. You begin to notice how much of your life was built on adaptation, how much energy went into fitting in, not belonging. And now you're being asked to choose authenticity over acceptance. That choice is not easy. It feels like betrayal of your past, of the people who knew the older you, and of the comfort you've carried for years. But beneath the guilt, there's a quiet knowing. If you stay, you'll start to disappear. Jung wrote that the psyche seeks balance, and when the inner world and the outer life no longer match, tension rises until change becomes unavoidable. So when you feel that internal split, that pull between the safety of the old and the honesty of the new, know this, it's not weakness. It's the pressure of growth. And what feels like falling apart is often the first proof that something true is trying to take your place. When you finally let go of the old, the habits, the patterns, the identity that once defined you, you don't immediately step into clarity. You step into emptiness. It feels like standing in a hallway where every door has closed, and the one that leads forward hasn't appeared yet. You wake up and feel like you've lost your map. The things that used to give your life structure, your plans, your sense of purpose, even your sense of self, suddenly feel weightless, meaningless, like distant echoes from a different lifetime. This is the part no one talks about. The space after you've outgrown your old life, but before you've discovered your new one. It's not peace. It's not certainty. It's the void. A quiet, shapeless place where you feel both lost and strangely alive. Carl Jung understood this phase well. He wrote that transformation requires a kind of death, not of the body, but of the false identities we once clung to. Before the new self can form, the old one has to dissolve. And that dissolution doesn't feel enlightening. It feels like losing control. You might feel restless, unmotivated, detached. You question everything, even the things you used to be sure of. You look around and nothing fits anymore. Not your surroundings, not your ambitions, not even your own reflection. You try to explain it, but the words sound hollow. So you stay quiet. You retreat into yourself, unsure if you're breaking down or breaking through. This is the psychological wilderness Jung described, a place where the outer world loses its meaning because the inner world is rearranging itself. You're being rewritten from the inside out. It's not visible, but it's real. Some days the emptiness feels unbearable. You want to run back to the comfort of the old life, to rebuild the walls you've just torn down. But if you look closely, you'll see that the emptiness isn't a punishment. It's a space, a pause between who you were and who you're becoming. It's the silence after the storm, the moment before something new takes shape. Your mind is unlearning old beliefs, your heart is adjusting to freedom, and your identity is searching for a foundation that feels real this time. Jung believed this void is necessary. He said that only by facing the emptiness without trying to fill it can we allow the deeper self to emerge, the one that isn't built on imitation or fear. And though this stage feels endless, it isn't. Slowly, clarity begins to flicker through the confusion. You start to sense faint direction, not in loud certainty, but in quiet intuition. You begin to feel what aligns and what doesn't, what pulls you forward and what no longer belongs. The void teaches you to listen, not to noise, but to silence. It strips away distraction so you can finally hear the voice beneath all voices. And that voice doesn't rush you. It waits. It lets you fall apart just enough to find what can no longer be lost. So when you feel suspended between two worlds, when you no longer fit where you were but can't yet see where you're going, remember this: you're not stuck. You're in the quiet middle of transformation. You're standing in the gap between who you were forced to be and who you're finally becoming. And though it feels like nothing is happening, everything is. You don't always notice it at first. Change doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It slips in quietly, like light through a half-open door. But then, little by little, you start to sense it. Something in you has shifted. The world hasn't changed, but your way of seeing it has. You begin to crave silence more than noise. You start to prefer solitude over company that drains you. The things that once entertained you now feel empty, while small, ordinary moments suddenly feel meaningful. You listen more. You speak less. And when you do speak, you choose your words carefully, not to please, but to express truth. You start noticing how much energy it takes to pretend. You stop trying to explain your choices to people who don't understand them. You no longer rush to prove your worth, because for the first time, you're beginning to feel it. And that quiet confidence doesn't come from validation. It comes from alignment. Carl Jung described this stage as the emergence of the self, the deeper, integrated part of you that was always there beneath the surface. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before you started hiding. You begin to outgrow certain conversations, not out of arrogance, but because they no longer feed your mind. You stop reacting to things that used to upset you, because you now see that not everything deserves your energy. You understand that peace is more valuable than being right. You start feeling drawn to things that match your new rhythm. People who speak from authenticity, environments that allow you to breathe, work that feels purposeful rather than performative. And even though your life might look quieter from the outside, inside, it feels fuller, heavier with meaning, lighter with noise. There's a subtle freedom in realizing you don't have to belong everywhere. You no longer bend yourself to fit spaces that were never meant for you. You stop chasing approval that once felt essential. Instead, you begin to build a calm inner foundation that doesn't crumble when the world shifts. Jung often said that transformation requires integration, a merging of the parts of you that were once hidden, denied, or forgotten. And you start to see that happening within you now. The confident parts meet the uncertain ones. The logical mind learns to listen to the quiet intuition. The past no longer defines you. It simply informs you. And though no one else may see the difference, you feel it deeply. You're no longer trying to return to who you were. You're learning to stand still in who you are, even when it feels unfamiliar. That's how you know you're changing. Not when life becomes easier, but when peace begins to matter more than perfection. When silence feels like clarity instead of emptiness. When you stop searching for where you belong, because you've finally started belonging to yourself. At first, you don't even realize it's happening. You just notice that the tension you've carried, the one between who you were and who you're becoming, starts to fade. The noise in your mind quiets. The pressure to explain yourself softens. And for the first time in a long while, you can breathe without pretending. You stop trying to fit in where you've already outgrown. You stop forcing conversations that no longer have meaning. You stop chasing people, places, and goals that once defined your worth, because you finally understand they were never proof of it. This is the moment when your inner world and your outer world begin to align. It doesn't happen suddenly. It unfolds in quiet realizations. You walk into familiar spaces and notice that you no longer shrink to fit them. You speak with calm instead of defense. You make choices that feel light, even when they're hard. Carl Jung believed that once a person aligns with their deeper nature, life stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like participation. You no longer live from reaction. You live from awareness. You no longer try to be understood. You simply exist as truth. The emptiness that once frightened you begins to feel like open air. You realize it was never a void. It was space. Space for something real. Space for rest, for clarity, for peace. You see now that what you lost was not your life, but the layers that once kept you from living it. You start to recognize the subtle freedom in letting things end. You no longer need to hold on to everything, because you trust that what's meant to remain will stay. There's no rush, no panic, no grasping, only quiet understanding. You begin to move differently, slower, but with purpose. You no longer chase meaning, you embody it. You realize that success without alignment feels hollow, and simplicity with authenticity feels full. The approval of others starts to lose its weight, not because you've stopped caring, but because your peace no longer depends on being seen. You've stopped asking, "Do they understand me?" and started asking, "Do I understand myself?" This is the kind of freedom Jung hinted at, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to no longer be divided within yourself. To act, speak, and live from one clear, centered place. You can sense it now. You no longer walk to escape the past. You walk to meet the future. You no longer fear the unknown. You welcome it because you've learned that what's waiting there is simply another version of truth. And you understand finally that outgrowing isn't losing. It's returning to your pace, to your peace, to the quiet rhythm of who you've been becoming all along. Then, almost without noticing, something begins to settle inside you. The confusion fades into clarity. The uncertainty turns into a quiet knowing. You no longer feel the need to rush, to prove, to justify. You move differently now, slower, but with intention. You've stopped searching for meaning in places that drain you and started building it where it naturally grows. This is the stage Carl Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, of allowing your inner and outer worlds to finally speak the same language. It isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's steady. It's the moment when the scattered pieces of your life begin to find their rightful place again. You start creating from honesty instead of habit. Your choices begin to reflect your values, not your fears. You no longer ask, "What should I do?" You ask, "What feels true for me?" And that question changes everything. You realize that every ending was actually an act of direction. Every silence, every separation, every loss, they weren't punishments. They were redirections, shaping you toward something more authentic. You begin to build a life that doesn't need to be performed. You're not chasing recognition anymore. You're building alignment. And that alignment feels like peace. A kind of peace that can't be taken away because it doesn't depend on anyone else seeing it. You notice that your goals are changing too. You're less interested in more and more interested in meaning. You choose depth over speed, purpose over noise. And even when life feels uncertain, you don't panic anymore because you trust your own direction now. Jung believed that when a person reaches this stage, they begin to live from the center, from a place where intuition and reason no longer fight, but move together, like two sides of the same truth. You can feel it. You're no longer trying to return to who you were. You're not seeking a version of yourself that's already gone. You're stepping into something more whole, a self that doesn't need to prove, compare, or conform. It's a quiet rebirth, not of the body, but of identity. You begin to trust silence as guidance, stillness as progress, uncertainty as a doorway. And what once felt like an ending now feels like space, the kind that allows something new to grow without force. You no longer need to say, "I'm changing." You simply are. And that's enough, because now you understand. The goal was never to become someone else. It was to finally come home to yourself. There comes a point where the search ends. Not because you've found every answer, but because you've made peace with the questions. You no longer resist the changes that once terrified you. You stop trying to rebuild what was never meant to last. The ache of letting go softens into calm understanding. You realize that outgrowing isn't rejection. It's respect for your own evolution. Carl Jung believed that true transformation isn't loud. It's a return to balance, a quiet integration of everything you've learned, lost, and become. You start to understand what that means now. You don't need to prove your growth. You live it, in the way you speak, in the way you choose peace over reaction, in the way you stop fighting to belong where your soul no longer fits. You see people differently too. You no longer judge those who stay behind. You understand that everyone moves at their own pace. And you no longer rush those ahead of you. You trust that you'll meet what's meant for you when it's time. So if you find yourself standing on the edge of who you were, unsure of who you'll become, don't rush. Don't force. Just breathe. It's okay if you don't fit in where you once did. It's okay if your old life feels too small now. You're not broken. You're just expanding beyond the limits of what once defined you. Because this quiet peace, this still strength, is what it really feels like to finally come home to yourself.